A man lies in a borrowed bed in a rented house on a Portuguese island. He is 34 years old. His wife sits beside him in the same dress she has worn for 3 days. She is 29 and pregnant with their 8th child. The room is unheated. Outside the window, the town of Funchal slopes down to the Atlantic. 6 weeks earlier, the man caught a cold while walking back from church. The cold became pneumonia. The pneumonia is killing him. The man dying in Funchal on the 1st of April 1922 had ruled Austria-Hungary for 2 years. His name was Karl. Karl I had arrived on Madeira 5 months before he died on the 19th of November 1921 aboard the British cruiser HMS Cardiff. His wife Zita arrived with him. She had been Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia, and the holder of 43 other titles that had taken a coronation chamberlain a full minute to recite. Now she was the wife of a man with no country, no income, and a cough that was getting worse. The villa they had been moved to was damp. The roof leaked. The British officers escorting them had been instructed that the Habsburgs were not to be allowed off the island. How a dynasty that had ruled most of Central Europe for 640 years ended up here, dying in a rented room on a volcanic rock in the Atlantic, is a story that begins with a law. On the 3rd of April 1919, the Constituent National Assembly of the new Republic of Austria passed an Act of Parliament. It was introduced by the Social Democratic Chancellor Karl Renner, a lawyer from Moravia, 60 miles from Vienna, who had spent his career in the Imperial Civil Service. The act was titled, in the dry German of legal drafting, "The Law Concerning the Expulsion and the Takeover of the Assets of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine." Austrians called it, then and now, the Habsburger Gesetz, the Habsburg Law. The provisions were short and total. Every member of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine was stripped of Austrian citizenship and banned from Austrian soil. Their private property, palaces, country estates, hunting lodges, art collections, family foundations, was confiscated by the state without compensation. The titles their family had carried for centuries were abolished. A Habsburg could return only on 2 conditions: a written and unconditional renunciation of all dynastic claims and an oath of loyalty to the Republic. There was no middle path and no appeal. This is the thing worth holding on to. The Habsburgs in 1919 did not lose only a throne. They lost the right to be Austrian. To exist legally inside the country their name came from, they had to surrender the name itself. The republic that had emerged from the wreckage of the empire could not afford a rival centre of loyalty, and the surest way to deny one was to make the family stateless inside its own homeland. Karl himself had never signed any of it. On the 11th of November 1918, at Schönbrunn, he had put his name to a different document, a careful piece of legal drafting that recognized the Austrian people's right to choose their own form of government and released his officials from their oath while pointedly avoiding the word abdicate. Historians later called it a masterpiece of diplomatic equivocation. Karl meant every comma of it. He believed he was still the rightful emperor, on temporary leave from the throne, and he spent the rest of his life acting on that belief. The Austrian Republic understood this perfectly. It is why the Habsburg Law was written the way it was. The wording assumed that a Habsburg might one day try to come back, and made sure that when he did, there would be no country left to come back to. A dynasty does not stop existing because a law says so. 640 years of marriages, baptisms, funerals, properties, children, languages and grievances do not disappear from a continent because a chancellor reads them out of a chamber. They go somewhere. What the Habsburgs became over the 100 years between the villa in Funchal and now is the part of the story almost nobody tells. Karl never saw any of it. By the spring of 1922, his lungs were filling with fluid, and Zita had stopped leaving his bedside. He died at noon on the 1st of April, holding a small crucifix she had pressed into his hand. He had been emperor for 1 year and 326 days, and an exile for 3 years and 4 months. His widow was 29 years old, and she had 8 children to raise on no money in a country where she did not speak the language. The dynasty's century in the wilderness had just begun. Karl had not gone quietly to Madeira. He had been put there because he had refused, twice in 7 months, to accept that the throne was gone. The first attempt began on the morning of the 26th of March 1921, Holy Saturday, when the former emperor boarded a train in Switzerland with a false passport in the name of a Spanish merchant. He travelled alone. He did not tell most of his own court that he was going. He arrived after dark at the bishop's palace in Szombathely in western Hungary and spent the night there as the guest of a sympathetic prelate. The next morning, Easter Sunday, he climbed into a small car and was driven the 150 miles to Budapest, to the royal palace on Castle Hill, to ask for his country back. The man he came to see was Admiral Miklos Horthy. Horthy had commanded the Austro-Hungarian Navy in 1918, the last man to hold that title, and had spent the chaos that followed quietly building a power base in the Hungarian countryside. By March 1920, the Hungarian parliament had named him regent, head of state of a kingdom that, by constitutional pretense, was still waiting for its king. Horthy was a monarchist in theory. The throne he was guarding was, in theory, Karl's. Karl walked into the palace without an appointment. He had not eaten since the night before. Horthy was eating breakfast when the door opened and his former emperor walked in. The conversation that followed lasted about 2 hours. Karl said he had come to take back what was his. Horthy said the moment was wrong. Karl, who had given Horthy his rank and his commands, asked what could possibly be more right than the lawful king resuming the lawful throne. Horthy said the little Entente, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia and Romania, the 3 states carved out of the old empire, had given private notice that a Habsburg restoration in Budapest would mean immediate war. Hungary, he said, would not survive it. Horthy had also grown comfortable in the regent's chair and had not built his power base in order to hand it back. But the war argument was real enough, and Karl knew it. He stayed in Szombathely for another week, increasingly ill, while diplomats in Paris denied that France had ever supported him. On the 5th of April 1921, he was put on a train back to Switzerland. The first restoration had lasted 11 days. The second attempt, in October, was not a quiet train ride with a false passport. On the 20th of October 1921, Karl and Zita climbed into a small biplane outside Zurich and were flown across the border into western Hungary. They landed near Sopron. Within hours, loyalist units of the Hungarian army, officers who had not forgotten the oath they had taken to him, began to assemble around the royal couple. Within 2 days, a column of about 2,000 men was marching towards Budapest with Karl at its head. The column reached the suburb of Budorsz on the western approaches to the capital on the morning of the 23rd of October. Government forces, units loyal to Horthy hastily mobilized, were dug in across the road. The 2 sides exchanged fire for several hours. About 40 men died on both sides combined. Karl, watching from the rear, was told by his commanders that the government troops were wavering and that one decisive push would bring them over. He gave a different order. He told his men to cease fire. He could not, he said, be the cause of Hungarians dying to put him back on the throne. By the next morning, his column had melted away. He was taken into custody on the 24th. The Allied powers had already decided what to do with him. On the 1st of November, British officers escorted Karl and the pregnant Zita to the Hungarian port of Bolyai on the Danube, where the river monitor HMS Glowworm was waiting. The Glowworm took them downstream to the Black Sea, where they were transferred to HMS Cardiff. The cruiser carried them around the southern coast of Europe to Madeira. They arrived in Funchal on the 19th of November 1921 with what they had been allowed to bring, which was not much. On the 6th of November, while they were still at sea, the Hungarian parliament passed a bill formally dethroning the House of Habsburg Lorraine. Hungary remained a monarchy on paper. It simply no longer had any particular family in mind for the job. What killed Karl on the 1st of April 1922 was a cold that turned into pneumonia in a house with no heating, on an income of almost nothing, in a climate his lungs could not tolerate. The medical cause is in the death certificate. The political cause is harder to write down. He had refused twice to accept the verdict of November 1918, and the powers who had imposed that verdict had answered by putting him somewhere he could not refuse it from. He died believing he was still emperor. Zita stood at the graveside in black. She was 29 years old. She had 7 children with her, and Elizabeth, the 8th, would be born 2 months later in a borrowed house in Spain. She had not yet decided that morning that she would never wear another colour, but the photographs taken at the funeral and the photographs taken 67 years later when she finally died show the same woman in the same shade of black, and somewhere between the two she had made a decision that the rest of her century would be spent honouring. The British cruiser HMS Newcastle put Zita ashore in northern Spain in May 1922, 6 weeks after her husband's funeral. She came down the gangplank carrying the baby she had given birth to in Lequeitio on the Bay of Biscay, in a borrowed house belonging to a Spanish cousin. The 7 older children walked behind her. The oldest was Otto, 9 years old, who had been raised since the age of 4 to expect that he would one day be emperor. He was now the head of the House of Habsburg-Lothringen, although nobody in the country he was standing in particularly cared. Zita was 30 years old. She had been an empress for 2 years and a widow for 8 weeks. She would spend the next 67 years travelling between addresses, none of which were her own. The first decade was Spain. King Alfonso XIII let them stay in a small palace on the coast, and Zita raised her children there on what she could scrape together from sympathetic European royalty and a few loyal Austrian aristocrats who still sent money. Otto and his brothers were tutored in the languages they would have needed to govern the empire that no longer existed: German, Hungarian, Czech, Croatian, French, English, Spanish. The training continued whether or not the politics caught up. In 1929, Alfonso XIII lost his own throne and the family moved on to a rented chateau in Belgium, where Otto took his doctorate at Louvain and the younger children grew up in something close to genuine peace for the only time in their lives. Then in May 1940, with the Wehrmacht advancing through the Low Countries, Zita gathered the children still at home and ran. South through France, into Spain, into Portugal, onto a ship in Lisbon, across the Atlantic to New York, and finally to Quebec for the rest of the war. After 1945, she came back to Europe, slowly, and in 1959 settled at Johannesstift, a Catholic residence in Zitzes in the Swiss canton of Graubünden. She lived there in 2 rooms, simply, for the last 30 years of her life. What Austria was doing to her in those years was absence. In October 1971, Zita's eldest daughter Adelheid was diagnosed with cancer in Pöcking in Bavaria. Adelheid had been the second oldest of the children, the bookish one, who had become a political scientist and lecturer in her own right. She was 61 years old when the diagnosis came. She died in Pöcking on the 2nd of October 1971, and the family arranged for her to be buried at Tulfes in Tyrol, back in Austria, where she had not been able to live, but where she had asked to be put to rest. Zita made a formal request to the Austrian authorities for permission to attend the funeral. The request was refused. The Habsburg Law was still on the books, and Zita, as the widow of the last emperor, was the person it had been written to keep out. The same legal text that Karl Renner had drafted in 1919 was, 52 years later, still operating on her with the same machinery it had used the morning it was passed. A republic that no longer feared a Habsburg restoration was applying the letter of a law that had been written when it did. Zita stayed in Zitzes. She received condolences from the same Austrian government that had told her she could not stand by her daughter's grave. She was, by the calculation of dates, more than half a century into the exile that had begun when she walked off HMS Newcastle in 1922. The arithmetic of a lost empire, on that morning in October 1971, came to a single woman in a Swiss residence being told she had the wrong nationality to bury her own child. The law was finally relaxed in 1982. Zita was allowed to return to Austria. She chose her date carefully. She crossed the border on the 17th of August, the day Karl would have turned 95. She was 90 years old herself. She died at Zitza's on the 14th of March 1989, aged 96. Her funeral was held in Vienna on the 1st of April, exactly 67 years to the day after Karl's death, at the hour he had died. The arrangements were made by her family, in private, for a private burial, which became, by the time the morning arrived, the largest public ceremony Vienna had seen in 73 years. The funeral mass was at St. Stephen's Cathedral. The intercessions were spoken in 7 languages: German, Hungarian, Slovenian, Croatian, Polish, Czech and Italian, one for each of the major peoples of the empire she had briefly been empress of. Around 8,000 people walked in the procession behind her coffin. The hearse was drawn by 6 black Noricum stallions along the same route that had carried Emperor Franz Joseph in 1916. It was the first Habsburg funeral in Vienna since the fall of the empire. Austrian state television broadcast the entire ceremony live. The coffin reached the Capuchin Crypt in the late afternoon. The tradition there is old and exact. A court official knocks 3 times. From inside, a Capuchin monk asks who seeks entry. The official lists the dead person's full titles. The monk replies that he does not know that person. The official knocks again, gives a shorter list of honours. The monk replies that he does not know that person either. The 3rd knock. This time the official says simply, "Zita, a poor sinner, asking for God's mercy." The door opens. 17 years earlier, the door had stayed shut. In May 1961, in a small office in the Bavarian village of Pöcking, a 48-year-old man sat down at a desk and signed a document his mother had told him never to sign. The wording had been negotiated for months with lawyers in Vienna. It was short. He, in his own words, expressly renounced his membership of the House of Habsburg-Lothringen and all claims to power derived from it. He declared himself a faithful citizen of the Republic. It was the document the Habsburg Law had been written to demand. Otto von Habsburg signed it anyway. He was the 4-year-old boy who had stood beside his father in the cathedral at Budapest on the 30th of December 1916, in white satin, watching a crown be placed on his father's head while a coronation chamberlain recited his future titles. He was the head of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. He had been one since his father died on Madeira when Otto was 9. He had spent the next 39 years moving with his mother through Spain, Belgium, the United States, Canada, and in those years he had taken a doctorate in political science at Louvain, worked the corridors of the Roosevelt administration during the Second World War. He is credited with helping roughly 15,000 Austrians, many of them Jews, escape to safety in those years, and reached a private conclusion his mother never accepted. The throne was not coming back. By the early 1950s, he had decided what to do about it. He married in 1951, moved to Pöcking in 1954, and started looking for work. The 1961 declaration was the price of admission. It gave him, in legal terms, a country. What Austria did with that fact was less generous than the law had implied. The Social Democrats, the political descendants of Karl Renner, argued in Parliament for months that Otto's renunciation was insufficient, that no Habsburg could be allowed back under any circumstances. The crisis pulled the governing coalition apart and very nearly brought the Austrian government down. Otto did not finally cross the Austrian border again until October 1966, 47 years after he had been carried out of Vienna as a 6-year-old. When he arrived, the Austrian trade unions called a one-day general strike in protest. He did not stay in Austria. He went back to Pöcking. In 1978, he took German citizenship, the country having decided what he was before his own had managed it. In 1979, at the first direct election ever held for the European Parliament, he stood as a candidate for the Christian Social Union of Bavaria and won. He sat in Strasbourg as a member of the European Parliament for the next 20 years. Here is the pivot. Otto von Habsburg was born in 1912 as the crown prince of an empire that disappeared 6 weeks after his 6th birthday, and 77 years later, he organized the border picnic that made the first physical break in the Iron Curtain. The picnic happened on the 19th of August 1989, on a stretch of fenced grassland between the Hungarian village of Sopron-Puszta and the Austrian village of St. Margarethen. The Hungarian reform politician Imre Pozsgay was Otto's counterpart on the Hungarian side. The cover story they sold to the Hungarian government was a friendly Austro-Hungarian celebration of European friendship, a few hours of music, food, and the symbolic opening of an old border gate, the brief crossing of small delegations from each country. The Hungarian government, which had been quietly cutting the border fence elsewhere since May, agreed to let the gate stand open for 3 hours. The Hungarian organisers had a different plan. Laszlo Mogas, one of the chief organisers on the ground, later said the slogan they had put on the leaflets was "Break it and take it." They wanted Hungarians to cut pieces of the border fence and carry them away as souvenirs. Mogas had not, however, accounted for who else would read the leaflets. By the morning of the 19th, thousands of East Germans were camped around Lake Balaton, 2 hours east of Sopron. They had been arriving all summer, in caravans and on trains, looking for any thinness in the Iron Curtain. Copies of the picnic leaflet, hand photocopied and passed around the campsites, had reached them in German. They came west by the carload. By the time the gate opened that afternoon, more than 600 of them were waiting in the fields just inside Hungary. When the gate opened, they went through it. The local Hungarian border commander, Lieutenant Colonel Arpad Bajla, had been given no clear instruction about what to do if East Germans rather than Austrians crossed the line. He made the decision on the ground. He forbade his men to use their weapons. The first East Germans across the field ran. The next ones walked. By dusk, the field on the Austrian side was empty, and 661 people had become refugees. 11 weeks later, the Berlin Wall was open. The picnic was the first organised mass crossing of the Iron Curtain since 1961. Otto von Habsburg, who had spent his life trying to find a way home, had spent the last day of his political relevance helping 661 strangers find a way through. Otto von Habsburg died on the 4th of July 2011, aged 98, at his villa in Perking. The funeral was held in Vienna on the 16th of July in St. Stephen's Cathedral, the same church where his mother had been laid out 22 years earlier, where his father had been declared the next emperor in 1916. His coffin made the slow walk down to the Capuchin Crypt, and the official knocked at the door 3 times. The third knock asked entry for Otto, a poor sinner. The door opened, and he was laid next to Zita. His heart went somewhere else. Following an old Habsburg custom, older than most of the countries the family had been thrown out of, Otto's heart was placed in a separate silver vessel and carried south to the Pannonhalma Archabbey in Hungary, where it was interred a day later. He had been trained as a child to be King of Hungary. He had served the country, in the end, by helping it become free. The split burial was the family's way of saying both things at once. In the same year Otto died, the Austrian Parliament took the final step on the law that had defined his life. In June 2011, it removed the last remaining clause of the Habsburg Law, the prohibition against members of the dynasty standing as candidates for the Austrian presidency. Most of the law had already been quietly dismantled before Austria joined the European Union in 1995. The presidential clause was the last of it with practical force, and the Austrian Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe had ruled it incompatible with basic democratic principles. 92 years after Karl had read the original text aloud, the same parliament removed the last sentence of it that still meant anything. The vote was not unanimous. It did not need to be. Otto's eldest son is named Karl. He was born in 1961 in Starnberg, Bavaria, technically stateless at birth, travelling as a child on a Spanish diplomatic passport because no country had yet decided what he was. He is 65 years old. He took Austrian citizenship eventually, served as a member of the European Parliament for Austria from 1996 to 1999, and since the 1st of January 2007 he has been the head of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, his father having stepped aside. What Karl does for a living tells a more interesting story than any title. He founded Blue Shield International in 1996, an organization that protects cultural heritage in war zones, sometimes described as the Cultural Red Cross, and served as its first international president until 2020. The work is unglamorous and dangerous. Karl himself has been on fact-finding missions to Libya during the Civil War, to Lebanon, to Egypt after the Revolution. The 1954 Hague Convention, which Blue Shield exists to enforce, gives marked cultural sites protected status under international law. Russia signed it. So did Ukraine. In Ukraine, he is doing something else as well. For more than 8 years before the Russian invasion of February 2022, Karl von Habsburg has owned and operated a Ukrainian-language radio network called Kraina FM, based in Kyiv. Since the invasion, the staff have continued broadcasting from an undisclosed location. For many Ukrainians outside the major cities, Kraina FM has become one of the essential sources of independent information through 3 years of war. The grandson of the man who refused to abdicate in 1918 spends 2026 keeping a radio station on the air in a country his great-grandfather never lived to see become independent. Karl's eldest son is named Ferdinand. He was born in Salzburg in June 1997, and he drives racing cars for a living. In June 2021, at the age of 23, he won the 24 Hours of Le Mans in the LMP2 class with the team Real Team by WRT, a dramatic last-hour win that took the team from 6th on the grid to 1st across the finish line. He also took the FIA World Endurance Championship title that year in the same class. His full given names, Ferdinand, Zvonimir, Maria, Balthus, Keith, Michael, Otto, Antal, Barnum, Leonard, Habsburg-Lothringen, take a paragraph to recite. On the side of his car, the team painted a single word. It read, Habsburg. It has been 103 years since Karl I died on Madeira, refusing to admit his throne was gone. His widow refused for 67 years. His son spent half a century working out what to be once he had accepted that it was. His grandson keeps a Ukrainian radio station broadcasting through a Russian war. His great-grandson drives a car around Le Mans with the family name on the door. The Habsburgs lost their empire in November 1918, and they spent the 100 years that followed learning to be Europeans without a throne. The empire is gone. The family is still here. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more stories about how the great dynasties of Europe ended and what they became afterwards, please like and subscribe and let us know in the comments which topic we should cover next.